Good morning. Morning. Hey, great. Awesome. Hey, great to be with you all here this morning. My name is Mark. I'm one of the pastors here at Northcross. Really warm welcome to you all. If you're new or you're visiting or if you've called Northcross home for some time, yeah, great to be here today with you. This time of the year, Han said last week that some research has shown that church attendance can be dependent on the weather. And there's probably some truth to that. I've done a little bit of my own research, and it turns out when we go through passages like we're going to go through today, it's the senior pastor's lowest attendance as well. But we'll get there in a moment. Hey, so today we're going to be continuing our series through the Old Testament book of Judges. And as Andrew and Han have described, this book follows a negative pattern where we see the further that Israel traveled into the promised land, into Canaan, the further judges intervened. And as God employed each successive judge, it seems that God's people had drifted and fallen further and further away from him. The spiral, it descends and gets deeper and deeper. Well, this week we're up to chapter 19, so if you have your Bibles, you can turn there, of Judges. We're now entering some of the final chapters of the book, of this book of the Bible, and we're now at a point in Israel's history where God's judges appear to have run out. There seem to be no more judges. Samson was the last one, and we all know that he died. And now the author provides insight into how truly bad things are going to get, as he shows us not only how flawed and evil God's people had become, or how flawed and evil his judges had become, but from chapter 18 on, especially 18 and 19, he also gives us a couple of accounts of how evil and flawed his own priests had become. Now, I don't know how I ended up with this passage. Of all the passages and people I could have been given to preach on throughout this whole series, it seems pretty coincidental that Andrew and Han plan to be out of commission on the weekend of this particular passage. They're both probably watching on their iPhones. I wrote this before I came today, but they're probably both watching on their iPhones, lying out on beach towels. Down at Mount Maunganui, Andrew will be sipping on his sugar-free hot chocolate, and Han will either have his imported Korean coffee or something, and if there's any South Africans here, you can help me with the pronunciation, something called rooibos. I don't know what that is. Which I believe is some type of foreign tea product. And when I tasted it, I figured it was extracted from the remnants of dirty sock water. Now, I know that's kind of heresy for many people here. I'm sorry about that. But just to let you know that Han and Andrew will be sending each other WhatsApp messages basking in how well they've set me up. Not only is it probably one of the most difficult passages in the Bible, but because we're kind of in this summer series or this summer time, they told me I've got 20 minutes to preach it. So I spent a few hours cutting my sermon in half to kind of fit it into their framework. We've been away this past week with my family. We've been down at a place in the Coromandel called Whuratoa with our in-laws. It's really fun going away because all sorts of fun things happen in the family, and especially as you're putting together a sermon, great illustrations come up. Whether they fit or not, you can decide on that after I tell you. So recently, lots of stuff happens. Like there's some bad stuff that happened. Like our older son Ben, he crashed his new bike and he got covered in cuts and stuff like that. Lots of kind of fights in between the young cousins. One moment, our youngest daughter Zoe, she comes running up to me and she's like, "Dad, Dad, Dad!" Jack, who is our middle child, she's like, "Jack just said the F word." I was like, "What?" She's like, "Yeah." I mean, because Zoe's 4, she's like, "Jack just said the F word." I was like, "Zoe, what's the F word?" And she said, "It's shut up." He said, "Shut up." I was like, "Oh, okay." Because it's like a word, it's something we've told our kids we're not meant to say in the house, so that's what she thought, so. Now I want to tell you, especially for any parents here, or if you're watching online, that the horrific details of chapter 19 that we're going to be going through can be actually some of the hardest that you'll find in the Bible, as it includes details that actually include sexual abuse and violence and rape. And because we have various age groups with us, I'm going to try to work my way and be really sensitive with that. But we also just want to give you a heads up that if you are vulnerable or if you have some vulnerable people with you and you know it'd be better for them not to hear this, then please feel free. You're more than welcome to take them out, or yourself as well, out of this room at any time. Or if this is triggering for you at any point, please feel welcome to get up and go. But just note, if anyone does get up and leave, it doesn't necessarily mean anything about their life history. They may be leaving to use the bathroom, to hydrate, to go for a walk because they're feeling tired due to the preaching, or they've gotten up way too early to watch some premier football match. Well, if you have your Bible here, why don't you turn with me? We're going to be in Judges chapter 19. Now, it's a long chapter, but I'm going to read. It's got 30 verses, but we're just going to read the story because it just gives great context, and then we'll go through and just give you a few points, actually 3 points, because as the theme of this kind of series is, it's kind of about people doing things that is right in their own eyes. And so we're just going to go through 3 characteristics that we kind of can pick out from this passage about how a couple of the characters there did things that were right in their own eyes. So yeah, let's read chapter 19. In those days, when there was no king in Israel, a certain Levite was sojourning in the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, who took to himself a concubine from Bethlehem in Judah. And his concubine was unfaithful to him, and she went away from him to her father's house at Bethlehem in Judah, and was there some 4 months. Then her husband arose and went after her to speak kindly to her and bring her back. He had with him his servant and a couple of donkeys, and she brought him into her father's house. And when the girl's father saw him, he came with joy to meet him. And his father-in-law, the girl's father, made him stay, and he remained with him 3 days. So they ate and drank and spent the night there. And on the 4th day they arose early in the morning, and he prepared to go. But the girl's father said to his son-in-law, "Strengthen your heart with a morsel of bread, and after that you may go." So the 2 of them sat and ate and drank together. And the girl's father said to the man, "Be pleased to spend the night, and let your heart be merry." And when the man rose up to go, his father-in-law pressed him till he spent the night there again. And on the 5th day he arose early in the morning to depart. And the girl's father said, "Strengthen your heart and wait until the day declines." So they ate, both of them. And when the man and his concubine and his servant rose up to depart, his father-in-law, the girl's father, said to him, "Behold, now the day has waned towards evening. Please spend the night. Behold, the day draws to its close. Lodge here and let your heart be merry. And tomorrow you shall arise early in the morning for your journey and go home." But the man would not spend the night. He rose up and departed and arrived opposite Jebus, that is Jerusalem. He had with him a couple of saddled donkeys, and his concubine was with him. When they were near Jebus, the day was nearly over, and the servant said to his master, "Come now, let us turn aside to this city of the Jebusites and spend the night in it." And his master said to him, "We will not turn aside into the city of foreigners who do not belong to the people of Israel, but we will pass on to Gibeah." And he said to his young man, "Come and let us draw near to one of these places and spend the night at Gibeah or Ramah." And so they passed on and went their way. And the sun went down on them near Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin. And they turned aside there to go in and spend the night at Gibeah. And he went in and sat down in the open square of the city, for no one took them into his house to spend the night. And behold, an old man was coming from his work in the field at evening. The man was from the hill country of Ephraim, and he was sojourning in Gibeah. The men of the place were Benjamites, and he lifted up his eyes and saw the traveler in the open square of the city. And the old man said, "Where are you going, and where do you come from?" And the Levite said to him, "We are passing from Bethlehem in Judah to the remote parts of the hill country of Ephraim, from which I come. I went to Bethlehem in Judah, and I'm going to the house of the Lord, but no one has taken me into his house. We have straw and feed for our donkeys, with bread and wine for me and your female servant and the young man with your servants. There is no lack of anything." And the old man said, "Be peace to you. I will care for all your wants. Only do not spend the night in the square." So he brought him into his house and gave the donkeys feed, and they washed their feet and ate and drank. As they were making their hearts merry, behold, the men of the city, worthless men, surrounded the house, beating on the door. And they said to the old man, the master of the house, "Bring out the Levite, the man who came into your house, that we may know him." And the man, the master of the house, went out to them and said to them, "No, my brothers, do not act so wickedly. Since this man has come into my house, do not do this vile thing. Behold, here are my virgin daughter and the Levite's concubine. Let me bring them out now, violate them, and do with them what seems good to you. But against this man do not do this outrageous thing." But the men would not listen to him. So the man seized his concubine, the Levite seized his concubine, and made her go out to them. And they knew her and abused her all night until the morning. And as the dawn began to break, they let her go. And as morning appeared, the woman came and fell down at the door of the man's house where her master was, until it was light. And her master rose up in the morning, and when he opened the doors of the house and went out to go on his way, behold, there was a concubine lying at the door of the house, with her hands on the threshold. He said to her, "Get up, let us be going." But there was no answer. Then he put her on the donkey, and the man rose up and went away to his home. And when he entered his house, he took a knife, and taking hold of his concubine, he divided her limb by limb into 12 pieces, and sent her throughout all the territory of Israel. And all who saw it said, "Such a thing has never happened or been seen from the day that the people of Israel came up out of the land of Egypt until this day. Consider it, take counsel, and speak." Our first point this morning, that's a pretty heavy passage. It's long, but a pretty heavy passage. And like I said, it's probably one of the darkest, maybe outside of, original sin, or maybe Jesus dying on the cross, probably one of the most dark passages that we're going to come across in the Bible. And like I said, why Han and Andrew aren't here. So our first point this morning is that being right in our own eyes leads to a perceived value problem because it dehumanizes people. A few weeks ago, I was playing tennis at our local Christmas tennis competition. We have a single court where we live with a bunch of people from our area. And I got chatting with this one lady who told me she grew up going to church and has adult children who attend church, but she stopped going many years ago. And she shared one of the reasons she finds it so hard to be in church. She said it's not because of Christian beliefs or values, because she agrees with most of them, but she stopped going because of experiences she had with church where people who claim to be Christian, to know and to follow Jesus, and who work for Christian organizations, harmed and sexually mistreated people in their care. Church and church people for her have not been safe. She shared a story with me of her time in youth group, where a church leader sexually mistreated some younger people in their congregation. And then another more recent story where it turned out that a married pastor in one of her family members' churches had a secret affair with a congregant whom he had developed an emotional and physical relationship with. It's stories such as these that should make us flinch. They should make us recoil. We should speak up and challenge any time we come across anything like this, any time we come across people, and even more so Christians, harming or mistreating people in their care. Any time we come across Christians living away from God's plans for relationship, for marriage, for family. Christian communities should be safe. Church staff, leadership, pastors, congregants should be people who can be trusted. But tragically, like many of us know, that is not always the case. And like many of us know or have heard, physical mistreatment, sexual abuse, alongside other forms of abuse, are much more likely to be perpetrated from people who are known than they are from strangers. Verse 1 starts out by giving us the major theme of the entire book. In those days, there was no king in Israel. So any time in the book of Judges, when we come across that, when that verse is in there, and it's in there a lot, probably like 8 or 10 times, I think the writer of Judges wants us to know that something bad is about to happen. That's another reminder. Hey, there's nobody out there calling the shots. Nobody's really in charge. People are running around and doing what is right in their own eyes. And it's the author's way of saying, listen up to the story, something bad is about to happen. And Judges 19 is the story of what happens when God lifts his finger from the steering wheel of history, when he turns people across to their own desires. You get what Judges 19 shows us, which is a world that is turned in on itself. And so there's this guy, a Levite, who's traveling from the hill country of Ephraim, and we're told he takes a concubine for himself from Bethlehem in Judah. And so right away, we're introduced to two people in this chapter. We're introduced to a Levite, and we're introduced to a concubine. Now, we can almost think of Levites, I don't know a better way to describe it, maybe as modern-day priests or pastors. The tribe of Levi was set apart by God to lead people towards worship, to help people towards prayer, to help lead people towards God and following his word. A Levite's life was supposed to be a life of helping people to know God and to live for God. But this Levite's life was anything but that. And then we're also told that he had a concubine. And in that culture, a concubine was part of a married man's household with all the responsibilities of a wife, but none of the privileges. The concubine was kind of like a secondary partner who had at least a position of double subordination to both the husband and to the first wife. Concubines were often younger girls of marriageable age, commonly acquired to instrumentally produce children for household service and sexual purposes, rather than for emotional intimacy or because what we may imagine as modern-day romantic love. And note in verse 3, the Levite is described as her husband, later in verse 27 as her master, but the concubine in the story is only ever known as a concubine or a young girl. She is never given the honor in the story of being described as the Levite's wife. Now, it's definitely not always the case, but as we read through Scripture, we come across stories of how people in positions of power mistreated and almost dehumanize or devalue those in their care, and this is especially true of concubines. For example, if we look back to Genesis, we see Abraham taking a concubine, Hagar, when his first wife, Sarah, attempts to help him produce an heir. And we all know how that works out. In Genesis 16, we read of Abraham's concubine, Hagar, fleeing into the wilderness for her own safety because of how severely Sarah mistreats her. And actually, Abraham tells Sarah something in Genesis 16, verse 6, which parallels the major theme of the book of Judges. Abraham says to Sarah, your slave, you call that your slave, is in your hands. Do with her whatever you please. Effectively, he says, do whatever is right in your own eyes. The concubine Hagar was their property. They owned her. They had power over her. And Abraham's encouragement didn't lead Sarah to consider what God might want, but only what she seemed suitable in her own eyes. And we find their treatment of Hagar yo-yoing as they went back and forth in their value of her being dependent on how useful they perceived her to be. It seemed one moment Hagar is wanted and valued, and the next she is rejected and spurned. And when we go through Judges 19, I think we find a similar thing happening. The Levite's treatment of his concubine seems to yo-yo depending on his changing perception of her value to him. This woman is property. This woman is treated as property by everyone in the story. At first, he wants her to benefit his own life, much like we find with Abraham and Hagar. Then there's some conflict, she leaves, and then he appears unmoved and content without moving towards her for multiple months. But something changes his perception of her value to him, and he pursues her to reclaim her, possibly because the issues which first led him to get a concubine had not changed back at home. So right away in the first 2 verses, the writer wants us to know the world has gone crazy. We see a priest who was supposed to be a man of God, a man who is meant to know God and God's plan that men have one wife, a man who is meant to be an example for others, a man who is meant to intercede for people, to protect the vulnerable, a man, verse 18, who actually was on his very own way to the house of God, and he has 2 sexual partners. If he takes a concubine, he's married. So right off the bat, the writer is wanting us to see this. The priestly man has a value problem. He dehumanizes the value of woman where he uses his concubine as his own instrument and property. This Levite is going to Canaanite out the Canaanites. And in our story in Judges 19, it tells us that the concubine fled the Levite, running home, staying there for 4 months. Now, some Bible translations describe the concubine as being unfaithful, sexually cheating on the Levite. This may have been the case, but just be aware that the text is really unclear on what this actually meant in the original Hebrew language. What makes it difficult to translate is that it is the only occurrence in the entire Bible, this particular sentence that we find here. What also makes the actions of the concubine problematic for us is that most of the ancient manuscripts that have been found, including the Septuagint, the ancient Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, they translated verse 2 not as sexual unfaithfulness, but instead saying the concubine was angry and furious with the Levite and left him because of her treatment of him, and she went back home. The Jewish translators of the Hebrew language translated her unfaithfulness not as sexual promiscuity, but as rejection, in the sense of after having lived under his oppression with the Levite, she wanted nothing to do with him. And as our story goes on, it seems like, well, the writer provides a lot of evidence that this guy, the Levite, was probably not the greatest person to be in relationship with. He's not a good man. He has some pretty big red flags. It makes sense to me that the concubine probably didn't want to live with him. And so this man, he just wanted his slave back. And so he went and he interacted with the father, and an agreement was met, and the man said it was time to leave. So he takes her, and they're heading back to Ephraim, where he is from. She's from Bethlehem. And so they're going back, they're sojourning, and his male slave said, hey, let's stop in the city of the Jebusites. And the Jebusites, which is Jerusalem at this time, was filled with Canaanites. The Levite responds, we can't stay with the Canaanites because they aren't our people. They're not going to welcome us, it's not going to be safe, so let's go back to Gibeah. And there we can find, and there that we can know Jewish hospitality is going to rank really highly. And so they bypass the Canaanites, they head to Gibeah, only to find out that the Gibeonites are even more worse than the Canaanites ever were. And this brings us to our second point this morning, that being right in our own eyes leads to self-preservation, even at the expense of others. You know, one of the cool things I love doing as a parent is reading books with my children before bed. Each of our children are at different levels of reading ability. Ben, who is 9, can pretty much, he pretty much reads both Georgie and I to sleep now. Kind of hits midnight and we wake up and we're like, oh no, we fell asleep during the story. With Jack, who is 7, he loves comic books. He'll get us to read a page, then he'll read a page. But Jack is also our sound effects kid, if you've had one of those. He doesn't just read action words, he makes all the impact sounds at really high decibels. And we often get sprayed with a little bit of spit in the process. Now, Zoe, who is 4, she is a real treat. Some of our neighbors actually come to this church. I'm not quite sure what they think takes place in our home when we're reading with Zoe. But if you're here or you're listening to this online, I just wanted to reiterate to you, there's nothing to worry about. No children were harmed. Zoe is at the stage where she's beginning to read and spell some 3-letter words, but she's also learning about punctuation symbols. Her favorite, of course, is the exclamation mark. I first described the exclamation mark to her as a way of speaking something that's important really loudly, almost like shouting to kind of emphasize it. Big mistake. Now, whenever we come across one of these, the words are not read. Zoe yells them at the top of her lungs. None of us get a choice of whether we want to pay attention to them or not. Well, in this story, there is a word that is repeated as well, and if we were the writer to Judges, I'm sure that they probably wouldn't be using my tone. I'm sure that he would be shouting more and more each time this word is shared. And that's what's, and the first time that we see it is actually at the beginning of verse 16. The author is about, and it's the word behold. The author is about to share something with us he sees as really important. He wants us, his readers, to pay attention to what is about to take place. And we're just told there's an old man who's walking home from work. He's running to him and he's like, hey, where are you staying? And the Levite's like, we don't have anywhere to stay. We were just going to kind of go and sleep in the park. The guy's like, you don't want to sleep in the park. And we know now why that's the case. But he says, hey, you don't want to stay out there. It's dangerous. Why don't you come and stay in my house? And this is where the story for the Hebrew ear would have sounded exactly like Genesis 19. In Genesis 19, that is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, describes how evil the world was in the nations outside of God's people. There are these two men who are angels or messengers of God, and these two men, they are threatened by pagan men of Sodom, and they demanded to have sex with these messengers, and Sodom ends up being destroyed because of it. And Judges 19, for about 4 or 5 verses, actually provides, in the Hebrew wording, a word-for-word exact retelling of that story, of what took place in Sodom and Gomorrah. In verse 22, we read, in verse 22, we read of a group of Israeli Benjamite men surrounding the house, and the Levite and his troop are taking sanctuary inside. They demand that the Levite, the supposed man of God, comes out so they can rape and assault him. And so what Judges is making clear is that evil, sin, and violence are not just things out there in the world. They are realities that are present, and at this time even worse, among the people of God themselves. And the places that should have been safe for this troop, the places and people that should have protected them, were the very places and people that they experienced harm from. And the man who owns the house comes out and he says, no, you can't do this. You can't do this despicable act. Instead, he offers up his virgin daughter, and the men still demand the Levite. And then we get to verse 25, and we come to discover the Levite illustrating for us the dark embodiment of self-preservation. Rather than going down with a fight, rather than sacrificing himself to protect and preserve the well-being of this woman he supposedly loved, we read that the Levite seizes this young girl and forces her to go out to face the sexual violence and physical abuse that he had been threatened with in his place to save his life. And at some point during the early morning hours, she died with her hands outstretched towards the threshold of his home. The thing most prominent in the Levite's eyes is self-preservation, and he does what is right by himself. He remains locked behind the doors. The man who was to protect his bride abandoned her, and she is beaten and bloodied, and it can't get much darker than this. The Levite, the priest of God, turns out to be an example of an antichrist. He's an antichrist-like figure by sacrificing the life of someone else to protect his own. If we think this is just an Old Testament problem, we're crazy. But all night this young woman is abused, and when we think things can't get anything, that things can't get any worse, the sun comes up. And her husband, who is now referred to as her master, he's undergone a title change. He was her husband in verse 3, he's her master in verse 27. He goes from being, and when the sun comes up, he opens a door. She's lying there with her hands outstretched. Theologian Chad Bird said she was caught between hell and hell. She was caught between the hellish mob who had done these unspeakable acts to her, and she was caught between the hell of a man inside the house who wouldn't open the door because he wanted to protect himself. And so after morning comes, the Levite wakes up and he goes to her, and she's lying there, hands on the threshold. She's obviously dead at this point. He opens the door, he looks at her, and he says, "Get up, let's go." But notice there is no running towards her. There is no comforting. He speaks to her from a distance, almost with indifference, as if nothing had happened. He's safe. His focus has been on his life being preserved, and so he doesn't realize that she's dead. And the writer doesn't tell us anything about whether the Levite was heartbroken. We aren't told about any pain he experienced, any sadness or any grief. The concubine doesn't respond. All we're told about him is that he loads her up and he takes her home. What we see here is that in the days of the judges, Israel didn't only lack a Christ-like leader, Israel lacked Christ-like people who would sacrifice themselves and lay down their lives for the sake of others. People who would give up their own sense of comfortability to help preserve the life of those they were in contact with and who were under their care. And so what that leads us to ask, maybe for our own selves, is a really important question when we think about who are the vulnerable people in our life. Who are the people that we have power over? Who are we responsible to care for? God forbid that we lock our doors. God forbid that we protect ourselves and use those who we are meant to care for to protect our own life. Because if we close our doors to the need and the sorrow and the pain of the people who are under our care, we are actually closing our doors to Jesus, because God and Jesus are with the people who are vulnerable. This brings us to our third point this morning, that being right in our own eyes leads to violence and vengeance. Recently, I had a conversation with my oldest son, Ben. Ben asked me, "Dad, why do some of my friends not believe in God?" "Well, son," I replied, "there are some things which make it easy to believe in God and to trust Him, like the reality that anything exists at all, as well as our experiences of beauty and goodness and love that are in our world." And then Ben adds, "and that Jesus was real and so many people saw Him." "That's right, Ben. But then there are some things in our world that make it hard for people to believe as well. Sometimes it can be hard to believe in a God we can't see. It can be hard to believe in God because it means we can't just do whatever we want. And it can be also hard to trust when we experience pain, when we have to endure or see others experience great suffering, or when it sometimes seems like God doesn't intervene and rescue us, or when people who claim to believe in God live as if they didn't know Him at all. It should be almost no wonder that God's people had continually drifted away from God when the very people, the tribe of Levites, who were supposed to be God's priests and ministers, the people who were meant to perform religious duties and lead God's people in worshiping Him, were just as, if not more terrible, than the people that they were guiding and providing care for. And this morning in chapter 19, verse 29, we hit a massive low in Israel's story. Outside the events of original sin, Jesus dying on the cross, this really does provide us one of the worst descriptions of humanity in the Bible we'll ever come across. The events of this chapter actually lead to the first civil war in the tribes of Israel. In verse 29, the Levite cuts his concubine's dead body into a bunch of pieces. And again, he doesn't do this because he is a jilted lover. He was angry what these men had done to his property. He cuts her into pieces, sends them all throughout Israel to incite support for his desire for even greater revenge through violence and retribution. We don't find the Levite turning to God. We don't find him inquiring of God how he would want him to respond. We don't find him leaving the situation to God's perfect justice. Maybe the priest didn't want to turn to God because he knew that God wouldn't satisfy the retribution that he desired in the way that he wanted. Instead, the Bible describes God as merciful, patient, long-suffering. That has been his pattern. Jesus quoted the Old Testament saying, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, bless those who curse you, pray for those who mistreat you, lend to them without expecting anything back. Then you will be children of the Most High, because the Most High is kind to the ungrateful and the wicked. Be merciful just as your Father is merciful." The character of God's true people is to be seen through the way that they embrace mercy, so that they imitate the life of God through how they live. If they have known mercy, then it will be evident in the way that they live, in their mercifulness towards other people. And the great offer of Jesus' arrival in the role of priest is the great realization of God's mercy. And so the greatest gift that we can offer people in our own lives is mercy as well. Jesus said, "By this all will know that you are my disciples, if you have love for one another." The character of his people is seen through the way that they embrace mercy. The Levite priest here is not the priest we are to emulate or desire. The Levite is supposed to protect, he's supposed to face danger, he's supposed to be reconciling people to God, praying for them constantly. The Levite was to sacrifice himself in the face of danger. Instead, he had become indistinguishable from the violent culture around him. And so he may have been born a Levite, he may have had the title of priest, but he sure didn't live as one. And this is what Judges wants us to see. It's the thesis statement of the whole book. Even the priests did what was right in their own eyes. But the failure of the human priest reveals our need for a greater and truer priest. See, the priest in this story threw aside his bride to the mob, and he saved himself. Jesus in the book of Hebrews is called the great high priest. Jesus came to rescue and to redeem. He came to sacrifice himself so God's people, his bride, could go and be free. Jesus was torn apart. He did not weasel out of his responsibilities. Instead, he walked straight into the angry mob, and it killed him on behalf of other people. Rather than perpetuating violence, he mercifully takes it to rescue those he loves and cares for. And that is really the meta-narrative of this entire book, of the entire Bible. Even as people do what is right in their own eyes, God still saves. His ultimate plans to save a remnant and redeem a people to himself is still accomplished. And we find God works his plans of salvation through this wicked nation of Israel, even during their dark ages, through the horrors and tragedies that we read through in the book in the time of the Judges. And as we look at the horrific scenarios that play out all over our world today, some in our own country, some in our cities, some in our neighborhoods and our places of work and study, some in our families, some which may come through our own hands. The evil, the violence, and the abuse that are there, that through it all, what God is continuing to do is to rescue people, to prepare his kingdom, even when it doesn't seem like it. And he's doing that with and through people who don't deserve it. He's doing that by seeing people as his prize. He's doing that by giving his life to preserve others. And he's doing that by taking on the violence of this world and responding mercifully to it. Let's pray.